Hi everyone, I've just finished painting this group of figures for the Crimean War. Apart from this figure here, which I had already painted, and normally I would put this video up in my playlist for the Crimean War. But while I've been painting these figures, quite a lot of thoughts have been going through my mind, and I thought I would actually put this video in a different playlist, in my Wargames playlist. But some of the topics I want to talk about, really, I could even have put this video, I think, into my What is History playlist, because what I want to talk about primarily is how do we as wargamers go about researching our armies and deciding on colour schemes and so on. So whilst I show you these models, and people with an interest in the Crimean War will be particularly interested to hear what I have to say, I hope. A lot of wargamers in general will be able to relate to what I'm talking about, I think, for their own periods of interest. And also, even if you're not a wargamer, I think there's a sort of metaphor in terms of what we take for granted or what we assume to be genuine evidence. There's a metaphor in there for the study of history in general. So this video might interest even people who haven't got an interest in wargaming. I don't know. Anyway, so when I talk about research, I'm really talking about research in inverted commas. I think wargamers in particular are a little bit prone to pretensions, and when we research, in inverted commas, our armies, we're not really doing proper research. So in my case, painting up my armies for the Crimean War, I mean, I'll hold my hand up and confess I've been winging it a little bit. I've really only had two reference sources that I've been using. One of them is a book which I purchased in a second-hand bookshop many years ago, but all the same, it has proved extremely useful, and it's Uniforms and Weapons of the Crimean War by Robert Wilkinson Latham. Now, this book covers all the armies, or the principal armies that fought in the Crimean War, and it's lacking in terms of colour plates, and the ones that there are don't provide you with very much in the way of useful material in order to paint your figures. There's a lot of black and white photography in the book, but its primary value to me has been the text, the actual descriptions of uniforms and equipment and colour schemes, colour facings for various regiments, that kind of thing. And so rather than actually looking at the illustrations or the photographs in this particular book, I've sort of used the very detailed textual descriptions to give me a clue as to how to paint my figures. The other book that I've relied on a lot, and wargamers I'm sure will relate to this, whatever period of history you're interested in, is an Osprey book It's part 2 of their series on the British Army on campaign, and it specifically covers the Crimean War. Now, I think when Wargamers say they've researched their armies, very often you'll find that all they've actually done is acquired a number of Osprey books. For other periods, in particular the Napoleonic Wars, for instance, that's been of interest to wargamers long before Osprey were around, so there are plenty of other reference books for how to paint Napoleonic armies. But for a period like the Crimean War, you really are restricted. Lots of literature on the Crimean War, obviously, but it tends to concentrate on the campaigns, the personalities, the actual political history, and so on, and doesn't have as its focus uniforms and equipment. Now, the thing about the Osprey books is, because wargamers have become so reliant on them, they are taken, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be, almost as gospel. But you have to take these books with a little bit of caution still. It's not a reliable or safe thing to only have one source. Mistakes can happen, and if that mistake is placed in a very kind of prominent position, then the mistake can be passed on, and this is as true of general history as it is of wargaming figures. When you get a series of books, or a book that achieves prominence and fame, it tends to be accepted as the sort of last word on that subject, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Now, I've said in the past, when I've shown some of these Eureka, these figures are from a range called Eureka. They're 18mm scale figures. I've said in the past that I really admire these figures. I think they're great sculpts and so on, and it's a really good range to purchase if you want to wargame the Crimean War. But I have had some reservations, in particular the furniture on the horses, which I've always thought of as a complete fudge. It's not accurate. In particular, if you take Cardigan here as an example, he's dressed in the uniform of the 11th Hussars, and his horse saddlery and furniture doesn't match what the 11th Hussars carried in the Crimean War. In particular, the Hussars had a sort of black sheepskin saddlery with what was known as a Van Dyke edging, a kind of scalloped edging in the colour of the regiment, which was a sort of crimson colour. And the models of the 11th Hussars, or the Hussars that Eureka produced, and this model of Cardigan, don't show that. They show a real kind of hodgepodge of blanket rolls and holsters for the pistols, and blankets on the horse, that kind of thing. They could easily have produced an accurate depiction of the horse furniture. And that's my first point, really, about how you are obliged to passively accept the research that is presented to you very often, and this is a particular case of that a sculptor of any range of historical figures is obliged to do a certain amount for himself or herself, and then before they actually get round to sculpting the model. As a wargamer and as a painter of these figures, I have no say in that process. I have to accept that these figures are historically accurate, and unless I question it with my own reading after the event and my own research, in inverted commas, after the event, my only choice is to either do as good a paint job as I can on what I can see, or if I'm really pedantic and really bothered about it, somehow go about changing the sculpt, adding my own little bits and pieces of milliput or something to it. I haven't got the skill to do that, and I'm not that pedantic that I worry about it that much. I'm simply presenting this to you as an example of how someone else's research can almost get written in stone, in this case cast in metal, and it becomes a sort of permanent representation of an historical event or personage. The same goes, although we don't think about this, once you have decided on colours to paint your uniforms and so on, the same goes for the paint manufacturers. That if a lot of ranges of paint do describe themselves as specific to particular uniforms or particular periods and so on. I tend to use a lot of Wargames foundry paints, and they are a good example. I'll get one out in a hurry here. Here's a paint in their Napoleonic series, which is called British Royal Blue. Now that colour, they're triads, so this is the light shade of that colour, but their paints are tied to particular periods of history. For instance, they have ranges for the Napoleonic Wars and for the American Civil Wars, or war rather. Again, if you purchase their paints, you are committed and you accept the research that the manufacturer of that paint has done in terms of matching the historical colours appropriately. So they are two examples of where we passively accept someone else's research. Now, another thing at our disposal is books. Now, in that case, as I said earlier, there are lots of books written about the Crimean War, and they will have illustrations in them, they will have photographs, they will have artwork that has been painted by military artists and so on in order to illustrate the books. To give you an example, I have a book in an old series of military uniform books called Blandford, and it's uniforms of the Imperial Russian Army, created by two brothers, Boris Mollo and John Mollo. Now, I obviously can't use this book for uniforms of the British Army in the Crimea, but it certainly has a number of plates describing uniforms and showing me the colours for the Russian Army in the Crimea. And when I get around to painting the Russian Army, it's going to come in very useful for that. But I want you to kind of remember the name John Mollo, because he is going to feature quite heavily in this video later on. So that's another resource that Wargames can go to, is sort of more general literature on the period of history they're interested in. After that, there are cinema films, and there are TV documentaries and so on. Now those, you really do have to begin to be cautious about using them as reference material. In the case of the Crimean War, there are two notable types of image in that respect. One of them is the 1968 film The Charge of the Light Brigade, and the other I would offer would be a documentary on the Charge of the Light Brigade that was produced by, I think it was Channel 4 originally, which came out in 2002. Now, the Charge of the Light Brigade, the film, is really based on actual events, obviously, but is highly concocted, and the story is written and scripted in such a way as to suit the story that the film is attempting to present. I think what I'll do is come back to that in a little bit more detail when I describe in particular this figure here of Louis Nolan. But just to point out at this stage that John Mollo, one of the co-authors of that book on the uniforms of the Russian Army, actually was employed by the makers of, in 1968, by the makers of the film The Charge of the Light Brigade, and his initial interests were in military history and in military uniforms, and I think he was a little bit of a kind of wargamer as well, and that was how he really got into the subject of history. And he became, as well as being a writer of military history guides to uniforms and so on, he was also a costume designer for the cinema, and in particular I think he was the creator of Darth Vader's outfit in Star Wars. But it's interesting to note that in 1968 John Mollo was threatened and barely escaped being taken to court for plagiarism in the sort of, he didn't write the screenplay of The Charge of the Light Brigade, but he did write a sort of a script which the owners of the copyright to or the owners of the rights to a book called The Reason Why, written by an historian called Cecil Woodham Smith. Cecil being a female name, actually, not a male as it might appear. But he was accused of plagiarising that book, and it took a lot of behind-the-scenes negotiations to actually stop the film company losing a great deal of money in litigation costs, which could have bankrupted them. And it was all down to the fact that John Mollo was accused of plagiarism, and there was certainly a decent case against him. He argued that all the kind of historical details were in the public domain, but at the same time he had clearly copied a lot of the style of the writing of Cecil Woodham Smith. So this gets you back really to what I was trying to say about how wargamers do tend to have pretensions to being more kind of academic historians. We're not. And I think John Mollo fell into the trap of really not doing his own original research, but falling back on sort of the research of other historians and other writers. And again, this is a way that history can be set in stone, as it were. That we tend now to refer to the film of The Charge of the Light Brigade almost as being a genuine kind of historical narrative, and it's nothing of the sort. Again, I'll come back to that when I talk about Louis Nolan in particular. But if we accept that of the film, and the film in itself is derived from a previous work of history, then really all we're doing is accepting the narrative of Cecil Woodham Smith, and we're not kind of filtering in other accounts, other perspectives, other kind of readings of what you might describe as the truth of the events of the Crimean War and the Charge of the Light Brigade in particular are. And although that might not seem to have any relevance to what I'm talking about, researching uniform colours and so on, you'll find later that it actually does, that the two parallel one another quite neatly. Now another thing that the wargamer can refer to are, as I said before, are books. And the Crimean War, unlike the Napoleonic Wars, photography was around in the Crimean War. It was in its infancy. So there are black and white photographs of soldiers and service men and officers and so on. So there are genuine depictions of those people rather than artists' impressions and so on after the event. Now they're in black and white, obviously, so you can't get much of a clue about colours from them, but you can get, again, as I'll come back to when I go into more detail in these individual figures, you can get information about what was worn, where it was worn, what it looked like. I mean, a good example of, to go back to the 11th Hussars, is that there are photographs of the horse furniture of the 11th Hussars, so you know from those black and white photos that it looked nothing like these Eureka figures. In terms of colour, you can get some kind of idea from the shades of grey, but you can also be misled. I've tried looking, and I'm afraid I've lost it now. I can't find the text anywhere. But I can remember reading a long time ago that in the case of U.S. Marines in the American Civil War, their facing colours from black and white photographs were often mistaken as being black, because the colour yellow, it was only found out relatively recently, the colour yellow on old black and white film and plates changes to a very dark, almost black shade. So you can't necessarily determine what sort of colour something was from its tone on a grayscale. So you can be misled, and as I say, mistakes like that can happen. They can then find their way onto the plates of military illustrations and uniform guides and so on, and then be proliferated. That mistake can be proliferated, and it's only kind of after a long period of re-evaluation and reassessment that you can correct that mistake. Now another reference material, which is slightly closer to the wargamer doing his or her own research, is that you can visit museums, and you can see artifacts and you can see uniforms, and the original uniforms as well, in museums, and from that you can get a much better idea of colours and so on. And in the case of the Crimean War, I have personally been able to do that, and I'm going to be showing you some examples of how that has facilitated my painting of figures and so on a little bit later on. And again, as I said earlier, there are a lot of illustrations of the Crimean War and paintings and sketches and so on, done by artists, sometimes much later on, sometimes in the 1900s or even later. And again, if you look at those for reference material, you are passively accepting that the illustrator or the artist has done his or her own research, and that the depictions of the uniforms in that artwork is accurate. And again, I'm going to show you how that can be misconstrued, because very often military illustrators do make mistakes and do get it wrong. Now, encompassing all of those things that I've been talking about, there's the internet, and that nowadays is what we as wargamers go to automatically, because on the internet you can find images of all those things. You can find clips from films, you can find copies of paintings, you can find photographs of museum artifacts. So the internet in itself is a huge source of reference material. But are we really doing research when we go to it? Yes, to an extent, but for all the reasons that I've tried to describe, with all the kind of mistakes that can get into all the things that are on in those paintings and in those books and so on in those films, just because they're on the internet doesn't mean to say that they are accurate. Now to give you an example of that, it's quite useful for us wargamers to look at images of other wargamers' work and see how they have painted their figures. I have found images of Crimean War painted figures on the internet, and I would question the accuracy of some of them. And ironically, I've also found images of my own work on the internet. So if I have made any mistakes on that, those mistakes in themselves are then going to be proliferated by other people copying what I've done. So again, it's a way that this is sort of very similar to my feedback analogy in my videos on what is history and complexity theory and so on. That really, if you make a mistake in your painting, that mistake is going to be amplified by other people seeing your work, copying it, and then other people seeing their work and so on, and you never get the opportunity to correct the mistake. So, and the final thing I think I would say before I get on to specifically talking about these figures is that at the end of the day you have to end up putting paint on the figures, and you have to satisfy yourself that you have done as much as you possibly can to do it accurately and to your own personal satisfaction. But to do that, you do use a little bit of your own experience and your own intuition, and even that can lead you to make mistakes. Now, a classic example of that was that a lot of the uniforms for the Crimean War are very similar to uniforms as they were worn during the Napoleonic Wars, and if you have painted Napoleonic Wargames figures in the past, you could be tempted to kind of carry on in that mode. So, for instance, the Hussars dress is very similar to kind of Napoleonic period uniform, but there were changes made in dress and style in the 40 years that separated the Napoleonic Wars and the Crimean War. And a classic example of that is that during the Napoleonic Wars, musicians and drummers and so on wore reverse colours. So if the facing colour of the uniform was yellow, for instance, so that a normal soldier's red coat would be red but with yellow cuffs and collars and so on, for the buglers and for the musicians and the drummers, they would wear a yellow coat with red collars and red cuffs. Now, you could quite easily fall into the trap of thinking that that still applied in the Crimean War, and you would be wrong, because that practice was dropped, I believe, in the 1830s. But it's an example of where anyone could make that mistake. Anyone who is colouring an image of a drummer in the Crimean War could make that mistake. So a military artist could do it, a wargamer could do it, and if that then gets seen and copied, the mistake gets proliferated. Right, so now, after a long preamble, I want to sort of look at these figures and in more detail, and specifically talk to you about issues that arose while I was painting these figures. Okay, so to start with, something that is common to most of these figures, with the exception of Louis Nolan, and Cardigan, is that they are all wearing frock coats of one kind or another, and the coloration of those, as far as I can satisfactorily work out, was a very dark blue. Now, there's an illustration of a Major General Pennyfather in the Osprey book. So I have specifically used that sort of colour for the ADC next to Lord Raglan here. There are plenty of other images on the internet that I've seen of other wargamers painting their command sets and their general officers wearing blue uniforms. But having said that, there are a number of illustrations I've seen, and in particular the two films, the Charge of the Light Brigade film and the TV documentary that came out in 2002, where a lot of the general officers aren't wearing dark blue, they are wearing black. Now, I don't think that is accurate, but you could quite easily copy that, what I think is a mistake, onto your figures. And it's a little bit perplexing. It reminds me of another example to give you, to sort of take you out of the sort of Crimean War and onto another period for a moment. When I first started painting my British figures for the Anglo-Zulu Wars, I had a very clear recollection in my mind of the film Zulu and the trousers that the British troops wore in that film, and I could distinctly remember them as black. And when you go back and look at the footage of the film Zulu, you can see quite clearly that they are black. And I think this is the same issue with the Crimean War uniforms, that the blue that they wore was extremely dark blue, to the point where it appears black. And that would certainly be the case if you were looking at black and white photography and trying to guess what the colour was from black and white photography, which goes back to my point about how black and white photography can be misleading. What would happen is that the blue would fade over time, and the darkness would diminish, so it was more obviously a blue colour. There is in the National Army Museum, which I visited recently, there is an officer's frock and cape in there, and it's quite obviously a very dark blue. So I've satisfied myself that I have got the correct colour for that, but it's just to give you an example of how you can see how those mistakes can creep in, particularly if you only look at one source of reference, such as the TV documentary, and you could be forgiven for thinking that the directors of the film and so on or the documentary have done their research, but you have to remember that it's not easy to dress cast on a film of that nature, particularly if you have many actors on it and many extras, and they all have to be dressed appropriately. You will cut corners, and you will make mistakes that you then have to duplicate hundreds of times over for all of the different actors and extras who are on the screen in front of the camera. So TV and cinema shouldn't be taken as being accurate. There's compromises that have been made, not only with the uniforms, but with the stories and the historical accounts and so on. It's done for dramatic purposes and purposes of streamlining scripts and so on. Now, staying on the subject of the film of the Charge of the Light Brigade, let's get on to this sculpt of Louis Nolan himself. Now, I think in this sculpt you can see a very clear reference to the 1968 film of The Charge of the Light Brigade in a number of different ways. For those of you who don't know the story of The Charge of the Light Brigade and so on, Louis Nolan was an ADC, and he was on the Lord Raglan's staff, and he was sent to dispatch a note to Lord Lucan, who commanded the cavalry, from Lord Raglan up on the heights, looking down on the Battle of Balaclava, to order Lord Lucan to recapture some guns that the Russians were carrying off on a ridge that Raglan could see, but neither Lucan nor Cardigan could see themselves from where they were positioned. And it's been a matter of controversy ever since why Lord Lucan mistook the guns that he could see at the end of the the North Valley, I beg your pardon, why he attacked those guns rather than recapturing the guns that he had been directed at by Raglan. And a lot of the blame has been placed on Louis Nolan, who was extremely agitated by the time he reached Lucan, and Nolan was a celebrated cavalry expert who had been frustrated by Raglan's refusal to use the cavalry appropriate in the war up to that point. And Nolan had lots of innovative ideas about how cavalry could be used. In particular, that used appropriately, cavalry could successfully take guns, could capture artillery batteries on its own without support, could break infantry squares, that kind of thing. And there's been lots of conjecture about whether Nolan had deliberately misled Lucan in terms of the objective of the charge or not. But anyway, Lucan ordered Cardigan to take the Light Brigade and charge the guns. So Cardigan was in no way responsible for the error, and resigned himself to his own death because he knew it was going to be a suicidal attack. But amazingly, he survived the attack, leading it from the front. But just as the charge had began, so the cavalry had only set off at a walk and then a trot at this point. Nolan had been given permission to join the charge, so he joined the 17th Lancers, but he rode out in front of Cardigan, screaming and waving his arms, and it's often been suggested that he had realised that Cardigan was going in the wrong direction, and he was trying to redirect the whole charge, and a shell burst over one of the first shots of the Russian artillery, burst overhead and cut through Nolan's chest and killed him. So Nolan was the first casualty of the charge, and he fell from his horse, screaming and dying, and the charge went on in the direction that Cardigan had assumed was the correct one. So I'm sure that this is a depiction of Nolan doing just that, waving frantically and trying to redirect the charge. And it's even reminiscent of the scene from the film, 1968 film, The Charge of the Light Brigade. And you will see on images of that that the sculptor has tried to depict that precise moment in the film. So it's a very cinematic presentation of Louis Nolan, and this is the point really about how the sculptor has done his own research in that respect, but is he doing it with the knowledge that the film was inaccurate, or is he reproducing visually, is he accepting the narrative of the film as well as the visual appearance of the film? And even if he isn't, others would be tempted to do so. And now the reason I say that is that Nolan, as I said, wasn't with any of the Light Brigade's regiments. He wasn't an officer in any of those regiments that took part in the Charge of the Light Brigade. He was actually an officer in the 15th Hussars who didn't serve in the Crimean War. He was attached to Raglan's staff as an ADC. So he was there on his own merit, and he had been asked for and detached from his regiment and sent and taken to the Crimea. He didn't wear the uniform of the 11th Hussars, and yet in the film, his character in the film is an amalgam, of lots of other incidents and so on that happened in the history of Cardigan and the 11th Hussars up until that date. And in the film, he is depicted as an officer in the 11th Hussars who had lots of run-ins and disciplinary proceedings with Cardigan. And in fact, those disciplinary incidents and so on, such as the Black Bottle scandal, I won't go into what that was now, but if you've seen the film, you'll know. That wasn't Nolan. They were other officers who took part in those incidents. But all of the problems that Cardigan had with his regiment up until that time have been amalgamated into one character, Louis Nolan, who is then also responsible for taking the note from Raglan to Lucan and resulting in the Charge of the Light Brigade. And you will find that, so not only has the sculptor has portrayed Louis Nolan as he was in the film, but others have then assumed that the film was accurate, and you will find on the internet, I'll put one up to show you, where this model has been painted in the style and in the uniform of the 11th Hussars, classically with the crimson trousers, and the 15th Hussars. Now the 11th Hussars had crimson trousers, or I don't think they call them trousers. I think they call them overalls or something. Let's call them trousers for the sake of simplicity. In the 11th Hussars, there were two yellow bands with what was known as a light between them. The only other Hussar regiment that served in the Crimean War was the 8th Hussars, and they had blue trousers with a single yellow stripe down the seam of the trousers. I couldn't find a depiction of the uniform of the 15th Hussars, because they didn't serve in the Crimea. So I wondered, I knew that they had blue trousers because only the 11th had crimson, but I didn't know whether they had a single yellow um, stripe down the seam or a double one, like the double stripe on the 11th Hussars with a light between them. And for officers, the reason this is gold is that for officers it would be gold rather than yellow. But luckily, I did find on the internet. So this is where, again, you see you can find things that are accurate. You can find things that are mistakes. I did find an illustration of Louis Nolan in his dress of the 15th Hussars, and it quite clearly shows that it was a single stripe. So I solved the problem that way. But the documentary that came out in 2002 depicts Nolan in a peculiar style of dress, and it does make you wonder why they did that. Did they do it in order just to demonstrate that he was what's the word? He was separate from his own unit, the 15th Hussars. So he would wear a particular style of uniform that didn't necessarily match other troops in the Crimean War, because they give him a sort of red vest with a blue, is it a dolman? I think it's a dolman over the top of that. But he's wearing the most extraordinary cap. It's like nothing that I could find to match anything in the Crimean War. Hussars did have a kind of pillbox type undress style cap. I mean, there's one on the front cover for the 11th of the book on the uniforms and weapons of the Crimean War. You can see it quite clearly there, and in that particular case it is coloured crimson because that was the colour of the 11th Hussars. Had he been wearing such a thing as a member of the 15th Hussars or the 8th Hussars, it would have been blue. So not only in the 2002 documentary is that colour wrong, but the whole shape and style of it is wrong as well. It reminds me almost of the kind of peak, it hasn't got a peak, but of the caps that the Hanoverian infantry wore in the Napoleonic Wars. I haven't found anything like it, so I'm sure it's wrong, but mercifully this particular sculpt doesn't have that on his head. It doesn't have anything on his head, because it shows him bareheaded with his hair falling back, just like the actor David Hemmings in the 1968 film. And another thing maybe to just to point out how you do get this kind of apostolic, almost sort of subtle acceptance of previous accounts and so on as time goes on, that the 2002 Channel 4 documentary is actually narrated by David Hemmings, the actor in the 1968 film. So is that a kind of nod to the accuracy of the film? You don't know, but the whole thing, you just get this steady kind of accretion of assumed knowledge and assumed certainty about an event that just gets embedded, so that it's very difficult to change preconceptions. So while I'm still talking about the Nolan sculpt in particular, maybe just go on to point out at this stage that because there is so little visual material for documentaries about the Crimean War and the Charge of the Light Brigade and so on, that 1968 film has been absolutely plundered for little clips and so on, and used in lots of documentaries since then. I mean, in particular, there's a film company, I think they're still around, called Cromwell, and they produce documentaries for television and so on. They ransack old cinema films, but that's partly my point about what I was saying earlier. You do fall into the trap of you see a historical documentary which shows you images from Hollywood or from the British film industry and so on, and it almost kind of like legitimises the appearances on it. So Cromwell had produced DVDs as well. I've got one about the Battle of Balaclava and the Charge of the Light Brigade. It's got lots of snippets from the 1968 film in that, which kind of reinforced that whole mistake about the way Nolan was dressed. So it's just this feedback loop going on again. As a kind of an aside, then, as just to give you another example of that in another period of history, the Battle of Isandlwana in the Anglo-Zulu Wars, about 1,400 British soldiers wiped out by the Zulus, biggest military disaster of the British Army facing a colonial army in history. And right from the outset of that defeat, myths have been propagated in order to somehow save face or whatever. One of the classic ones being that the Zulus were able to overrun the British lines because the British weren't supplied adequately with ammunition, and that the quartermasters and so on were reluctant to hand it out, and it was kept behind the lines and so on. And that was a myth that was kind of propagated almost from the outset. Colour Sergeant Bourne of the who was present at the defence of Rorke's Drift actually spoke on the BBC radio documentary I Was There in the 1930s, and the recording is now missing, but the script of it still exists. And he recounts, he tells a little bit about the story of the Battle of Isandlwana, which took place on the day of Rorke's Drift, and he himself mentions the failure of the ammunition supply, and he gets that from presumably from the remnants of the centre column who came back through Rorke's Drift on the day after the Battle of Isandlwana. They had been separated, so they didn't take part in the Battle of Isandlwana. They returned to the battlefield to find that there had been this massacre, and then departed Zululand via the depot at Rorke's Drift, thus relieving the siege of Rorke's Drift. But a lot of those people who were in the surviving half of the second column made a lot of assumptions about what had taken place on the battlefield based on their own suppositions of what they saw in the darkening light of the day as they got there in the evening. And they didn't look too closely, but they just made a lot of assumptions about how, asking themselves how could this tragedy have happened. And one of them was that they couldn't have had enough ammunition, because the Martini Henry rifle had such a rapid rate of fire that they could easily, in terms of mathematical terms, have fired enough accurate shots to have eliminated the Zulu attacking force. But it's quite plain now from a small amount of archaeology that has been done on the battlefield of Isandlwana that the British lines were far too extended, that the lines were actually placed much further out from the camp than has previously been thought, and are even outside. There's a perimeter fence around the historic battlefield site, and it was always assumed that the British lines had been inside that perimeter fence. In fact, they've found remnants of ammunition boxes and the ring pulls and metal parts of the ammunition boxes way outside what has been assumed to have been the historic battlefield. And it shows not only that the British forces did have ammunition and they were accurately supplied, but they were much further out, and what that meant was that their line was spread out way too thinly, and the Zulus had been able to infiltrate their line, and that was how the British lost the battle. So it was to do with their dispositions rather than this myth of the poor ammunition supply. But that myth has been propagated through the cinema in exactly the same way that a certain number of myths about the Charge of the Light Brigade had been propagated by the cinema. In particular, there was a film called Zulu Dawn, which has a number of scenes in it where the quartermaster is forcing people to queue up for ammunition and so on, and it's not getting to the lines in the quantity that's required to hold the Zulus off. So it's a good example about how all us wargamers and military buffs and enthusiasts and so on just passively accept these things, and it's not necessarily the truth, and all these things often require re-examination. Okay, now let's move on. I'll talk to you about this figure here, which is General James Scarlett, who commanded the Heavy Brigade in the Crimea, and in particular was at the head of what has been termed the Charge of the Heavy Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava. More on why I use those words in a moment. So there are a number of pieces of reference material that I used to paint this figure up. Let's start with what I found on the internet, which is an illustration of the Charge of the Heavy Brigade by a military illustrator called Charles Staddon. Now, Staddon, to you veteran wargamers out there, will be a recognisable name. He is another wargamer, and he was one of the original sculptors of a range of figures called Staddon figures, I believe. They're 30mm tall, mainly Napoleonic figures, and they became part of the tradition of Mayfair range. So a lot of wargamers of the generation previous to me, the sort of Donald Featherstone's generation, now sadly all passing away, will recognise the name. But his figures are still around. I was privileged to see some owned by a gentleman who invited me over to his home near Tiverton a year or two ago, and his figures are still played with. They're still bought and sold on eBay. But a wargamer, again, one of these people whose interest in military history comes out of this sort of interest in wargaming, and he went on to be quite a celebrated military artist as well. And the picture of the Charge of the Heavy Brigade is one of his works, and I could compare that to an actual artifact that I have seen, this one being in the York Army Museum, and it's the helmet worn by General Scarlett at the Charge of the Light Brigade. Now, hopefully you'll be looking at an image of that at this point. You will notice that he has a plume on it, and this model doesn't have a plume, and Staddon's illustration doesn't have a plume. That isn't a mistake. During the Crimean War, the heavy brigades who wore this particular type of helmet didn't wear their plumes. So you have to be careful, because the artefact in the York Museum is indeed the helmet that was worn by Scarlett at the charge of the Heavy Brigade, and in fact it's got a dent in it in the front where he took a blow from a Russian sabre. But it's not the helmet as worn, it's the helmet worn. So that helmet Scarlett retained until his death in I think it was 1877, and it remained in his family. So the plume would have been placed back in it on Scarlett's return from the campaign, and he would have worn it on parade, he would have worn it for ceremonial duties, and the family would have kept it in that condition. And it was only placed in the public domain in 2002, when the family had to relinquish it for tax duties. Really, it's a bit like these families that give up their homes or pass them over the National Trust or whatever, because they can't afford to pay death duties on inherited wealth and so on. So they donate artifacts of historic interest, and the family handed over to the public domain, and it's now in the York Army Museum. This helmet, as a sort of in place of a taxation of a certain amount of money. So there are plenty of black and white photos. This is going back to what I was saying about photography being useful, of heavy dragoons in the Crimea, and you can see quite plainly that they didn't wear plume. But you will also notice from Staddon's illustration, because he painted this long before the helmet came into the public domain, that he's got the helmet completely wrong. He's given it a kind of black leather appearance. It was a brass helmet, and the officers, it would have been a gilt brass, so it would have been far more of a gold appearance. And you can see what a sort of shiny lustre it has from the York exhibit. You won't be able to see. I have taken close-up pictures of all these models, but officers in the dragoons had a steel plate at the front. For other ranks it would have been a brass plate on a brass helmet, so you wouldn't have noticed it. But there was a steel plate, again quite polished, so quite a shiny metal, so hard to distinguish from the helmet. And in fact, you can't, in my painting, you can't distinguish it either. It's just lost in the shine of the kind of brass colour. But there would be a star shape plated onto the helmet, and then on top of that a sort of star and garter motif, which again was in gilt brass. So there is a very small amount. If you're painting this particular a model of General Scarlett in a larger scale, then you will need to note that his helmet isn't entirely brass. There is a tiny amount of steel showing at the front. So I was quite pleased to be able to get that. I'm sure that's accurate, and I've done a little bit of my own kind of research in a way there. But a mistake that I have made, and you will probably not be able to see it, is that he's actually wearing, underneath his coat, he is wearing the tunic of the 5th Dragoons. I think they're called Queen Charlotte's or Princess Charlotte's Dragoons. They're the 5th Dragoons. And I have given him a blue collar, assuming that it was a guard regiment of some kind, and they all had blue, and that is wrong. Scarlett commanded the 5th Dragoons for about 14 years before the Crimean War, and their colour facing was green, and I had looked at the Staden illustration and I didn't look at it closely enough and thought it was blue, and it's not. Staden got it right and I misidentified that and coloured it blue. But as I say, you can barely see the collar on an 18mm figure, so I haven't bothered to go back and repaint it, particularly as a lot of it is covered in a gold braid anyway, so it's a tiny fleck of colour, so I'm not going to bother to go back and repaint it. Oh yeah, but while I'm on the subject of the charge of the Heavy Brigade, because I did talk about it using sort of slightly strange terms earlier, this is another myth, just like the myth of the ammunition supply at Isandlwana and so on. It's a myth that the Heavy Brigade charged at the Battle of Balaclava. They basically, they were being repositioned across to the South Valley, and the massive amount of Russian cavalry came over the crest of the ridge that separated the North and South Valleys, and they were exposed to a flank attack, and for some reason the Russian cavalry performed extremely hesitantly on that day. They'd already been repulsed by the thin red line of the Highlanders once, and Scarlett reacted very quickly and very sensibly and just wheeled his entire brigade around and ordered them to attack or to charge the Russian cavalry, but they were heavily outnumbered and attacking uphill and only a tiny distance away from the cavalry, and they never got up to charge speed. It's very difficult to charge uphill anyway, but this is an example about how the sculptor of this particular model is not necessarily representing Scarlett at the charge of the Heavy Brigade, but he's certainly representing him as charging. So is he reiterating that myth of the charge of the Heavy Brigade? Difficult to say. I would say yes, and in fact Staden's illustration does exactly the same things. He shows the Heavy Brigade as charging. Didn't actually happen that way. It was a much more controlled, they almost walked into the massive Russian cavalry and cut their way through in a really desperate struggle and out the other side. As I say, they were vastly outnumbered, and it was a magnificent feat of arms, but didn't happen in... There's always been this attempt to kind of reproduce the charge of the Light Brigade, which happened later in the day, as there being another charge in the Battle of Balaclava as the charge of the Heavy Brigade that succeeded, whereas the Light Brigade's charge failed. So it's another myth that's been reproduced in our wargaming kind of vocabulary. Right, let's go on to the base that I made. So I've based the ADC and Raglan together because this is going to be my overall command base for my British Army. And I think I've said already, won't talk too much about the ADC figure. Again, mercifully, both these two figures, the sculptor hasn't attempted to kind of give them too elaborate horse furniture, so there's no inaccuracies to be apologised for there. So I copied, as I said earlier, the illustration of Pennyfather in the Osprey book for the ADC. It does concern me a little bit that all there's really only one pack of command figures for the British Army in the Crimean War that Eureka do. They do a pack of dismounted officers and so on, but on horseback this is all you've got, other than they do a model of Colin Campbell, who comes separate from this pack. But Colin Campbell was the Highland Brigade, so Highlanders in kilts and so on. You got Nolan, who's an ADC, dressed as a hussar, so cavalry. Lucan, who was the commander of the cavalry in totality. Cardigan, who commanded the light brigade. Scarlett, who commanded the heavy brigade. So it's all cavalry. So you haven't got any infantry officers on horseback, other than possibly this ADC that you could use. Having said that, Lucan is in a kind of dress that would be suitable for an infantry commander. But if you wanted to get some infantry commanders, you've got to buy all this pack again and reproduce, duplicate your purchase of Nolan and Cardigan and Raglan. So it's a bit of a shame they don't do a few more officers on horseback, I would say. But anyway, let's go on to Raglan. So, not difficult to represent Raglan as a wargaming figure. He'd lost his right arm at the Battle of Waterloo, just under 40 years earlier. So he's got a sleeve pinned to his jacket there, his right arm, and he's got the famous telescope that he used in his left arm, which has got, you can't really make it out too well on this model, but it has got a stock. It was mounted onto a musket stock or a rifle stock, so that he could carry it just using his left arm, and that is actually viewable in the National Army Museum, which I visited recently. But unfortunately, it's not a big thing. But the sculptor of this particular model hasn't accurately portrayed the telescope. It's just a single kind of cylinder. Hasn't got any of the telescopic inserts into it. So I don't know why he did that. It's not, as I say, it's not a big thing, but it is an example of where you are when you purchase these models, you are stuck with what the sculptor gives you. So it's a bit of a shame that it's slightly inaccurate. Not a big thing, but just another example about how we have to accept what we're given, really. And it did occur to me when, having said that Raglan only had one arm, so how did he adjust the telescope? Was it fixed? Is that why the sculptor doesn't give us that telescopic structure? Because he assumed that there was no way that Raglan could, I don't know what the right terminology is, but retract and contract the telescope in order to focus. Did he assume that it was of a fixed focus and therefore didn't need the telescopic arrangement? Possibly, I don't know. But how does a one-armed man holding a telescope to his eye adjust the sort of focal length of the telescope? I don't know. Right, and then finally, let's go on to Lord Lucan. Now, as I said before, this is a fairly kind of bog standard depiction of an officer, a mounted officer of the Crimean War. So you could use this figure to represent other characters than Lord Lucan, but this is how Lucan is portrayed in film, other than the way I painted it, because he's often portrayed with a black coat. But I'm sure this is quite an accurate figure for any mounted officer, really, of the Crimean War. So a nice figure in that respect. Lucan was, this Lord Lucan was the great grandfather of the infamous Lord Lucan, who murdered his nanny, mistaking the nanny for his wife, who he intended to murder in 1974, and then disappeared from life. Possibly he may have committed suicide. He's never been heard of since, and that's really where I kind of wanted to end this this little talk on historical accuracy, really, by taking a kind of a step out of the Crimean War and out into the general realm of historical veracity and so on, because it was a dreadful tragedy, really. Lucan's Lady Lucan died last year, I believe. The turmoil in her marriage and her relationship with Lord Lucan had revolved a lot about, they'd split up, and a lot of it revolved around who had custody of their children and so on. And it ended with, the whole affair ended really with Lady Lucan being estranged from her children, and Lord Lucan, the father, disappearing. But Lady Lucan died last year, cut her children out of the will in the end. Her will barely spoke to them in the intervening years since 1974. And recently Lord Lucan as well has been officially declared to have be deceased, so that the 8th Lord Lucan could take over the title. But the children, particularly the 8th Lord Lucan, refused to accept that their father was guilty of that murder. They still insist that it was an intruder, someone else who had killed the nanny. And it's a good example, really, about how history can be denied, the veracity of history can be denied, and so on. And slightly kind of depressing note to end this video on, but I think I'll stop at that point. So thanks very much for listening and watching, everyone, and see you on the next video. Bye for now.